He told her she'd never be enough. Not beautiful enough. Not strong enough. Not worthy enough to stand beside him. And for a while, she believed him. Because when love turns cruel, even truth sounds like a lie you start to repeat to yourself. But silence can be a dangerous weapon, especially when it belongs to someone who once cried every night. Years passed. Faces changed. But then he saw her again. And for the first time, it was his heart that sank. Because she became everything he ever wanted. And everything he could never have again. But before I continue, make sure you're subscribed to the Revenge by Sophia channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. We love to see how far our stories travel. The house was quiet that evening, too quiet for a home that once echoed with laughter. The rain tapped against the window like 1,000 tiny fingers trying to warn her of something. She sat on the couch, staring at the clock that never seemed to move, listening to him pacing in the kitchen. Every step sounded heavier than the last. "Why are you so distant lately?" she asked softly, her voice trembling like the flicker of a candle about to die. He didn't answer at first. He just sighed, poured himself another drink, and said, "Maybe I'm tired of pretending you're what I need." The words hit her harder than she expected. She wanted to speak, to argue, to make him remember what they once were, but all she could do was stare at the half-empty glass in his hand. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, as if the night had been waiting to echo his cruelty. And somewhere deep inside her, a small voice whispered, "This is the beginning of the end." Days turned into weeks, and the words only grew sharper. He stopped saying good morning. He stopped looking at her the way he used to. Every time she tried to bridge the distance, he cut her down with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Do you really think you could survive without me?" he asked one night, laughing as she stood in the doorway, clutching her sweater tight. Her voice cracked. "Why would you say that?" "Because it's true," he said coldly. "You'd fall apart without me." His words sank deep, not like a knife, but like poison, spreading slowly until she began to believe them. She stopped dressing up, stopped dreaming, stopped laughing. The mirror became her enemy, showing her a face she barely recognized, tired, pale, hollow. And yet, somewhere in that reflection, a single spark still flickered. A spark that whispered, "Maybe I can still leave." But could she? Could she really walk away from everything she once called home? It was past midnight when she finally made her choice. The house was dark, except for the dim light of the kitchen lamp. Her suitcase sat by the door, small and trembling like her own hands. He was asleep in the other room, or pretending to be. She didn't check. She couldn't. Every step toward the door felt like walking through quicksand, heavy with fear and guilt. She paused for a moment, looking at the photo on the wall, the two of them, smiling on a brighter day that no longer existed. She touched the frame gently, whispered a quiet goodbye that cracked halfway through. When the door closed behind her, the night air hit her like a wave of freedom and frost. For a moment, she almost turned back, waiting, hoping. Maybe he'd come after her, say her name, stop her. But he didn't. Only the wind answered, carrying away the echo of her last tear. And as she stepped into the dark street, alone under the rain, she didn't realize that night wasn't her ending. It was the first step toward the kind of revenge that doesn't need blood, only silence. Morning came slowly, gray and uncertain. The city outside was alive, cars passing, people talking, yet she felt like a ghost moving through another dimension. Her small apartment was barely furnished, just a mattress on the floor, one lamp, and a single chair by the window. The air smelled of rain and old paint. Her breath sounded too loud, as if silence itself was pressing against her ears. She made coffee, though she barely drank it. Every clink of the spoon against the cup reminded her of his glass hitting the counter. She turned on the radio for company, but every song seemed to mock her, lyrics about love, loss, and moving on. When she closed her eyes, she could still hear his voice. "Without me, you're nothing." The words looped through her mind until even her heartbeat seemed to echo them. She whispered into the stillness, Maybe he's right. But the silence that followed didn't agree. She tried to call her old friends, the ones who once swore they'd always be there. At first, they answered with polite sympathy. "You'll find someone better," they said. "Just focus on yourself." But soon the messages stopped. The calls went unanswered. She realized that people loved her when she smiled, not when she broke. The loneliness crept in slowly, like a shadow sliding across her skin. At night, she lay awake listening to the ticking of the clock, each second louder than the last. Her phone lit up once, a message from him. "You'll come back. You always do." She stared at the screen until her hands began to shake. Then, without replying, she deleted his number and turned off the phone. For the first time, she didn't cry. She just stared out the window and let the city lights blur into something that almost looked like hope. But hope was dangerous. It whispered promises she wasn't sure she could believe. Days turned to weeks, and the silence became her only companion. But slowly, very slowly, that silence began to change. It stopped feeling empty. It started feeling peaceful. She began to walk more, through the park, through the quiet streets, through parts of the city she never noticed before. She watched strangers smile at each other, watched sunlight fall through tree branches like gold dust. She began to wonder if maybe life could start again, piece by piece. One evening, she passed a bookstore. A help wanted sign hung in the window. Without thinking, she walked in and asked for the job. The owner, an old woman with kind eyes, smiled and said, "You look like someone ready for a new chapter." The words stayed with her all night. A new chapter. For the first time in months, she slept without dreaming of him. But in the quiet corners of her heart, something darker began to stir. Not hate, not anger. Something colder. Something patient. The kind of silence that waits. The first morning she woke without crying, she almost didn't notice. The air was crisp, and sunlight spilled across the floor in fractured shapes through the blinds. For a moment, she stood there, barefoot, coffee in hand, watching dust dance in the golden light. It felt unfamiliar but good. At the bookstore, her days passed quietly. She shelved stories about survival, heartbreak, and healing, never realizing she was living one herself. The smell of old paper became her comfort, and the bell above the door was the heartbeat of her new life. Sometimes, she caught herself smiling at small things, the laughter of a child in the aisle, the sound of rain tapping the glass, the hum of music in her earphones. Every evening, when she locked the shop and walked home under the soft streetlights, she whispered, "I'm still here." But late at night, when everything went still, she sometimes wondered if he ever thought of her too. Months passed, and with them, something began to change. She started running in the mornings. The cold air stung her lungs, but it felt like cleansing fire. Her reflection in the mirror began to look stronger, less fragile, more alive. Her eyes, once hollow, now carried quiet fire. She found herself dressing differently, not for anyone else, but because she wanted to feel her own presence. In the bookstore window, she caught her reflection one afternoon and didn't look away this time. There was power in the way she stood, even in stillness. One of the regular customers, a kind man who always bought poetry, smiled and said, "You look brighter these days." She smiled back, softly. Maybe I finally stopped standing in the dark. That night, she stared at her reflection again. The woman in the mirror wasn't broken anymore. But the question lingered, what happens when he sees her now? One rainy afternoon, she stayed late at the bookstore. The world outside blurred into silver streaks, and thunder murmured in the distance. She opened a blank notebook and began to write, not for him, but for herself. Every line was a confession, every word a piece of herself she was taking back. The rain grew heavier, drumming against the windows, and with each sound, she felt stronger. She wrote about the nights she almost gave up, about the silence that healed her, about how pain had carved her into something unshakable. By the time she stopped, the page was full, trembling ink, but steady words. She whispered them out loud, feeling their truth. Outside, lightning flashed. For the first time in years, she didn't flinch. She simply watched the storm and smiled, because this time, she wasn't afraid of it. But storms have a way of bringing things back. And far away, on another quiet night, someone from her past was about to notice her again. It began with small ripples, whispers of recognition. The bookstore owner noticed her natural way with people, the way her voice carried calm, even in chaos. Soon, she wasn't just organizing shelves, she was managing orders, planning events, hosting small readings that filled the air with soft laughter and poetry. One evening, during a local author's night, a photographer asked to take her picture for the city magazine. She hesitated, shy, unsure. But the bookstore owner said, "Let the world see what I've seen all along." The article called her a quiet spirit with eyes that hold 1,000 untold stories. For the first time in years, her name appeared in print, not as a memory in someone else's story, but as the main character of her own. When she saw her photo in the glossy pages, she didn't cry. She only thought, he'd never recognize this version of me. And that thought made her smile. But somewhere out there, recognition was coming, whether she wanted it or not. Her days began to move like a film in slow motion, filled with golden light, soft jazz from the radio, and faces that looked at her with genuine admiration. People wanted to know her story. To them, she was mysterious, composed, graceful, someone who had lived through storms and somehow emerged shining. She started giving small talks about rebuilding confidence and finding peace after pain. Her voice trembled the first time, but only for a moment. Then it steadied, growing sure, magnetic. Every eye in the room followed her. Every heart leaned closer. When she finished, the applause sounded like thunder rolling in her favor. And for a fleeting second, she felt the ghost of his words, "You'll never be enough." But this time, she smiled and whispered under her breath, "Watch me." Later that night, she sat by her window, city lights flickering below, and felt something new, not revenge, not triumph, something softer. Freedom. But freedom has a price, and the past, like smoke, always finds a crack to seep through. The article spread further than she expected. Her photo appeared online, shared again and again. The woman who rose from nothing, the face of resilience. Compliments flooded in, but among them, one message made her breath catch. It was from an unknown account. Just 4 words. "I always knew you." She stared at the screen, heart thudding. The message was simple, too simple, but it felt like a whisper from a life she buried long ago. She locked her phone, tried to ignore it, but her reflection in the window looked different now. Stronger, yes, but no longer alone. Somewhere in the city, a man scrolled through her photo on a glowing screen. He didn't blink, didn't smile, just whispered her name like a secret he shouldn't remember. He had said she'd never be enough. Now, she was everything he could never reach. And for him, that realization was just the beginning of his torment. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that felt harmless, almost too peaceful. She was walking out of a cafe, her phone in one hand, laughter still lingering from a friend's goodbye. The sun was soft that day, wrapping the street in warm gold. The world felt wide, open, safe. Then she froze. Across the road, leaning against a car, stood him. For a second, the noise of the city faded. The cars, the chatter, even the wind. All she could hear was her heartbeat, heavy and uneven. He looked older, tired, but those eyes, she would have known them anywhere. He saw her. His lips parted slightly, as if trying to form her name. And for the first time, she didn't feel fear. She felt nothing. She turned to leave, calm and steady. But behind her, his voice broke through the noise. "Wait, is it really you?" She didn't turn around at first. Her mind told her to walk away, to let the silence speak for her. But something, maybe curiosity, maybe closure, made her stop. She turned slowly, meeting his gaze across the distance. He walked closer, uncertain, his steps hesitant. "You look different," he said quietly, his tone laced with something between awe and regret. She smiled faintly. People change. He nodded, eyes searching her face like a man looking for a ghost. I've thought about you, he murmured. About us. Her expression stayed calm, unreadable. Funny, she said. I stopped doing that years ago. The words landed softly, but their sting was sharp. He laughed under his breath, trying to sound casual. You really moved on, huh? She tilted her head. You told me I couldn't. I had to prove someone wrong. For a heartbeat, he said nothing. Then, quietly, he asked, Can we talk sometime? And the way she smiled before walking away, calm, almost kind, was worse than any insult he could have imagined. Because silence had never looked so powerful. That night, he couldn't sleep. Her image haunted him, not the girl he remembered, but the woman she had become. He scrolled through her social media, her articles, her interviews. Every photo was a knife wrapped in beauty, proof that she had thrived without him. He poured a drink, staring at her smiling face on the screen. How? He whispered to the empty room. How did you turn into this? The room stayed silent, except for the echo of her last words. I stopped doing that years ago. Meanwhile, she sat by her window, city lights blinking far below. The meeting replayed in her mind, not with pain, but with clarity. She didn't feel the need for revenge anymore. She'd already won without lifting a finger. But deep down, she knew this wasn't over. Men like him never let go easily. And somewhere, under his guilt and longing, something darker was beginning to awaken, an obsession that would soon cross the line between regret and madness. He thought seeing her once would calm the ache, that curiosity would fade once he proved she was still real. But instead, it only made the silence louder. Every night, he saw her face when he closed his eyes. Not the tearful girl he left behind, but the woman who had looked at him like a stranger she'd already forgiven. He started replaying old memories like broken tapes, their laughter, their fights, the night she left. He remembered her trembling voice, the way the door closed, the stillness that followed. Back then, he'd felt relief. Freedom. Power. Now, that same silence mocked him. He poured another drink, trying to drown it out, but the echoes stayed. And when he looked at himself in the mirror, he barely recognized the man staring back. She's better off without me, he muttered, but even he didn't believe it. Somewhere deep inside, a new truth began to burn. He needed her back, even if it destroyed them both. Meanwhile, her life moved on, or so it seemed. Days were full, her career blooming, her laughter genuine. But when the nights came, her thoughts betrayed her. That encounter had opened a door she thought she'd locked forever. She would catch herself thinking of his expression, the way his eyes had softened, the tremor in his voice. Not because she missed him, but because a part of her couldn't understand why now. Why fate had brought him back just when she had finally made peace. The unease began to creep into her quiet moments, in the empty bookstore aisles, in the stillness before dawn. Sometimes, she swore she heard a familiar voice in passing, or footsteps behind her on her walk home. Each time she turned, nothing. Just shadows, just wind. She told herself it was in her head. But deep down, she knew better. He was watching. He began to appear in places she went, not close enough to speak, but near enough to see. At first, it was coincidence. Then it wasn't. A glance in the crowd. A reflection in a window. The briefest moment of recognition before he turned away. She felt it, that magnetic pull between the past and the present, the unfinished story neither of them had asked to reopen. One evening, she found a letter slipped under her apartment door. No name. Just a single line. I'm sorry for everything, but I can't forget you. Her hands shook as she read it. The handwriting was familiar, uneven, rushed, the same as before. She folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer without a word. Then she turned off the lights, sat in the dark, and whispered to herself, He's not done. And outside her window, across the street, someone stood under a street lamp, unmoving, quiet, watching. The first message came late at night. Can we talk? She read it under the dull glow of her bedside lamp, her heartbeat calm, almost too calm. Then she set the phone down without replying. A day later, another message.
Please.
I just want to see you once. She muted the conversation, but the silence between each notification felt heavier than any reply could have been. It was strange. Years ago, his words had broken her. Now, they barely touched her. He began calling from unknown numbers.
Once. Twice.
Over and over. She didn't answer. The call stopped after a week, but the unease didn't. Because silence isn't always peace. Sometimes, it's the sound before something breaks. And deep inside, she could feel something beginning to shift, not in fear, but in power.
The roles had changed.
And he was the one losing control. For him, her silence was unbearable. Every unanswered call felt like an open wound, every quiet moment like punishment he couldn't escape. He told himself he just wanted closure, but that wasn't true anymore.
He wanted to be seen again.
He wanted her to need him again. He started driving past her street at night, headlights dimmed, music off, just to see if a light was on in her window. Once, he saw her silhouette moving slowly across the room, peaceful, distant, untouched. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. In the rearview mirror, his own reflection looked hollow, desperate, almost haunted. He whispered her name like a prayer, but it came out like a confession. She was supposed to come back, and for the first time he realized she wasn't the one trapped anymore.
He was.
Weeks passed. She didn't answer, didn't call, didn't block him either. Her silence was surgical, not cruel, not emotional, just absolute. And that, more than anything, drove him mad. He tried one last time. He sent a final message. I'm sorry. You were always enough. She read it.
Once. Twice.
Then she deleted it, not with anger, but with peace. There was no satisfaction in it. Only release. Later that night, she lit a single candle by the window and whispered to the empty air. I forgive you, but I'll never look back. Outside, rain began to fall, steady, unending, cleansing. And far across town, he sat in the dark, staring at his silent phone, realizing that her absence was louder than any scream he'd ever heard. For him, the silence was punishment. For her, it was freedom. He tried to move on, at least that's what he told himself. He deleted her number, buried the photos, and promised to stop checking her name online. But fate has a cruel way of keeping reminders close. Her face appeared in an online article about women who rebuilt their lives. Then in a magazine feature, her name bold and proud under a headline that read, Becoming Enough. He froze when he saw it. That phrase, those very words he once used to destroy her. At first, he laughed. Then, something inside him cracked. He clicked on the article, reading every line like a man searching for a version of himself in someone else's success story. But he wasn't there. He was the ghost between the sentences, the warning, the shadow, the forgotten mistake. When he closed the page, her voice echoed in his head again. I stopped thinking about you years ago. And suddenly, forgetting her became impossible. He started seeing her everywhere, or at least he thought he did. A woman on the train with her same perfume. A laugh in a cafe that sounded almost like hers. Even the songs on the radio began to feel like her handwriting across the air. He began to lose track of time. Days bled into nights, nights into blurred dreams where she stood just out of reach, smiling, untouchable. He'd wake drenched in sweat, her name on his lips, his heart hammering like he was running toward something that no longer existed. He told himself it was guilt, that it would fade eventually. But guilt doesn't stare back from every screen. It doesn't whisper in your mind when you're alone. And when he saw her on a billboard, her eyes fierce, her smile calm, he finally understood. She wasn't haunting him. He was haunting himself. He stopped going to work, stopped answering calls. The apartment grew dark and cluttered, filled with empty bottles and old memories. One night, he played one of her interviews again. Her voice was steady, calm, the same voice he once silenced. When the interviewer asked what motivated her, she smiled faintly and said, Sometimes, the people who break you the most are the reason you rebuild so strong. He threw the remote across the room, the screen shattering into fragments of her face. The sound echoed through the silence, sharp and final. For a long time, he just sat there, staring at the broken reflection of the woman who no longer needed him. His chest felt heavy, his breath uneven. He whispered, almost in prayer, "I made her strong." But even as he said it, the truth burned deeper. He didn't make her strong, he made her free. And now, he was the one trapped inside the cage he built for her. The days had stopped having names. He woke to the same dim light, the same silence, the same ache in his chest. The mirror by the sink was coated in dust, but he could still see enough of himself to know this wasn't the man he used to be. His face was drawn, eyes hollow, skin pale like candle wax. He reached out, touching his reflection as if it could speak. "Who are you?" he whispered, voice trembling. The man in the glass stared back, a stranger made from regret and sleepless nights. He remembered the way he used to mock her, the way he had watched her break. Back then, he'd called it strength, control. But now, all he saw was cruelty. He tried to smile, but his reflection didn't move. Then, softly, like a confession escaping on its own, he said, "I didn't love her. I loved the way she needed me." The silence that followed was unbearable, and in that silence, he finally understood the weight of what he'd done. He walked through the city one evening, trying to disappear in the crowd. The lights were too bright, the noise too alive, everything he wasn't. Every face he passed reminded him of her smile, her eyes, her calmness the day she walked away. He stopped outside a bookstore window, her bookstore, the place she rebuilt her world in. Through the glass, he saw her laughing with customers, moving gracefully, untouchable in her peace. He wanted to go inside, to say something, anything. But when she turned toward the window, he froze. Their eyes met through the glass. She didn't flinch, didn't smile, didn't frown. She just looked at him, not with hatred, not even pity, but with quiet understanding. Then, she turned away. He stood there long after she was gone, staring at his own reflection in the glass instead. It looked exactly like it did in his bathroom mirror, hollow, faded, and full of ghosts. And in that moment, he realized something worse than losing her. He'd lost himself long before she ever left. That night, he wrote a letter, not to win her back, not to ask forgiveness, but to finally speak the truth. The handwriting trembled across the page as he wrote, "You were never the problem. I was. I said those things because I was afraid you'd see how small I really was." He stopped, the words blurring through his tears. "You didn't need me to be enough. I needed you to make me feel like I was." He folded the letter carefully, but he never sent it. Instead, he placed it inside a book she once loved, a book still sitting on his shelf, untouched since the night she left. When he turned off the lights, the apartment felt different, quieter, softer, almost like forgiveness was somewhere near. He closed his eyes and whispered, "I hope she never has to read this." Because in truth, she didn't need his words anymore. He wasn't part of her story now, only the lesson at the end of it. Weeks later, the letter found its way back to her, not by him, but by chance. A mutual friend dropped off some of his old belongings, and inside one of the boxes was that folded page. Her name was written across the front in the same handwriting that once made her heart ache. She held it for a long moment, fingers trembling slightly. There was a time when she would have read every word, searching for meaning, for apology, for closure. But now she didn't need to. She placed the letter inside a drawer unopened. Then she whispered softly, "I've already forgiven you." And as she closed the drawer, the sound felt like the last door of the past finally locking shut. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, soft, golden light spilling across her desk. It wasn't an ending. It was release. Her life had become something new, not perfect, not free of pain, but hers. She spent her mornings in quiet peace, her afternoons building the business that once existed only in her dreams. People came to her for advice, for strength, for stories of how she rebuilt from the ashes. And sometimes, When she spoke about pain, her voice would soften, not from sadness, but from gratitude. Because the pain had shaped her, but it no longer defined her. One afternoon, she looked out the window and saw the city glowing under the evening sun. The same streets where she once walked with her head down now shimmered with light. She smiled faintly, her reflection in the glass steady and strong. "Enough," she whispered, not to anyone, but to herself. For the first time, she didn't have to prove it to anyone else. He never reached out again. No calls, no messages, no unexpected encounters. It was as if the universe had finally decided to place them in two different worlds, one moving forward, one left behind. Sometimes she thought about him, not with anger, not even sorrow, but with understanding. He had been part of her story, yes, but not the story's end. Some people enter your life as storms, only to teach you how to rebuild your own shelter. As night fell, she stood by her window, candle flickering beside her, the same way she did months ago. The city lights shimmered below, and the silence wrapped around her like peace. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight finally lift. And as she blew out the candle, the smoke curled upward like a whisper. A farewell to everything that no longer belonged to her. Tomorrow would be new. And this time, it would be hers alone. They say time heals all wounds, but they never tell you how beautifully scars can shine under the right light. He used to believe she needed him to feel complete. Now, he carries the weight of knowing he was the one who is never enough. She doesn't hate him. She doesn't remember the hurt the same way. Because her story stopped being about revenge long ago. It became about rebirth, the art of becoming someone so powerful that even your past bows in silence. And maybe that's the real justice, not in his suffering, but in her peace. Because the truth is, she never needed him to see her worth. She just needed to see it herself. And once she did, he could never touch her again.